all come. I'm just basically going to read you a story of my life in art, and hopefully it's a story that some of you can identify with. And everybody's comfortable and okay and all that? Okay, so I'll get going. My visual sense was really developed underwater. I remember hours being spent in my childhood trying to stay below the surface because I was so mesmerized by the light penetrating and transforming the most ordinary of things and making them glow and radiate like shimmering diamonds. These summer days were my happiest of times, for I felt as if I left the earth and was transported to an unbelievable world where everything was dancing with light. To this day, I still ache for those times when I was enveloped by this feeling of rapture. I must have carried this feeling around within me, for as a young adult, it was rekindled a short time after I moved to New York City, when I saw an exhibition by sculptor and land artist Robert Smithson, best known for the gorgeous spiral jetty constructed in the Great Salt Lake. In trying to answer questions in our lives, sometimes we come across visions that state things so beautifully, so poignantly, that a vision becomes a work of art with a soul of its own and reason for being, as if it had always existed. That's how I felt when I saw this exhibit. One of the pieces I saw in the gallery was a mound of salt crystals in a mirror configuration that when you lay down turned into an infinite sea of light and crystal. It was breathtaking and life-transforming, and in an instant I was shot back to those moments of so long ago, when I was all sensation, when I became sensation, when I momentarily left the earth again. While I had done some art experimentation of my own, it was this exhibit that really stirred me. I have always loved the figurative element, or at least my broad definition of the figurative, as in the breathtaking work of Paul Klee. For me, it is a human touch that reminds us of our earthly existence and our trying to break free of those boundaries and constraints, yet often failing, but sometimes succeeding. Which leads me back to Robert Smithson. I took his idea of the mirrors and added the figurative and snapped photos of the images inside of mirror containers I made. I had an obsession with freezing time, with trying to extend boundaries and capture them on film, giving them meaning by focusing on the figurative and the infinite, play of light as it bounced off the mirrors, reflection upon reflection upon reflection, much like light bouncing off the surface of water. While this is art of years ago, I maintained my love for extending and playing with frames that confine. I have never been interested in the traditional in any facet of my life. I continued to experiment with different materials, but it isn't until I found collage that I feel things really came together for me art-wise. I had a lapse of years where I didn't do any art at all, having been derailed by life circumstances, namely my diagnosis of bipolar disorder, which I only mention because the extreme moods of manic depression, sometimes going from pole to pole very rapidly, or even being in both poles at once, only furthered my love of playing with frames and borders, trying to see exactly how far I can go before things begin to fall apart, and using this to try to visually express the tenuousness of life. Using wood, paper, photographs, and ink as my primary materials, I have learned that nothing is out of bounds. And here I owe a debt to the sculptor Eva Hess, whose use of unusual materials, such as latex, rope, fiberglass, and earlier on, anything that was hanging around. Her sculpture is at once beautiful, soulful, absurd, poignant, hilarious, tragic, philosophical, but most of all visionary. All the things that life is made up of. She helped redefine beauty by taking the discarded, the mundane, and transforming them into profound pieces of art. I try to do the same with the materials I use. I am mad about color and dynamics, texture and layers, and the interplay of them with the figurative. I am awed at how the slightest application of color, a simple movement of an object, can make a collage something exceptional or entirely fail. How the whole is truly whole. Charlie Chaplin, the filmmaker, once said that it didn't matter how much a comedic bit was successful. If it made the movie subordinate to the bit, it was out. And so I might find a snippet of a collage beautiful, but if it doesn't fit in with the vision in its entirety, it is changed. So what spurs my art? Simply life. Art is life, and life is art, for me at least. Life is not trivial, and this is where we all start, trying to grasp the essentials of life. Each person tries to make sense of life in their own way. For me, it is an art that I try to come to terms with living. I believe we are all born to keep our own histories, and how each of us does this is a truly personal and sacred quest, though for me not sacred in any religious sense. The specifics differ for each of us, but for each the foundation is a human one. We all exist and all must answer for ourselves who we are and why we exist. For me, the question, what is art, is just an extension of what is existence. Art is not devoid of life on earth, it is rooted in it. It means digging and uncovering for myself the symbols for me that best convey visually what it means to live on earth. The past, the present, the future, with its universal, earthly, human, and personal relics that existed, exist, or will always exist. As long as I have been doing my art, I have looked upon it as a personal history, my chronicle, yet a chronicle that others can identify with. I guess artworks become in some ways relics once they are disengaged from the artist and are let to stand out or fall on their own. Time merely makes them stand out. And this whole concept of time, ever since I realized that time is an earthly construct, I have been fascinated, particularly after I read Einstein. Can you imagine the imagination it took to distance yourself from everyday reality and envision time dilation, the slowing of time? I was just totally blown away. I look at my aging hands on earth, and yet if I were to be traveling toward the speed of light, that aging would occur much more slowly. Just think of that. But we are bound by Earth's physical laws and all the contradictions that implies, and sometimes we even experience a simultaneity of events, of emotions, which I like to express visually in my collages, with transparency side by side with solidity, a solidity that provides a thread of visual stability. I don't believe art can be taught, or at least not taught to me, as life can't be taught. Each of us goes around sometimes with no clue. We have never lived before, so we can only go by past experience and search and discard what isn't working. In art, there are visual stories to be told, with each person interpreting the stories differently, depending on their own experience and emotions. Stories of boundaries, of breaking boundaries, of simultaneity, of trying to grasp many things at once. But this is where it gets really interesting. Art's root is crisis, for life itself is extreme and contradictory, plagued by boundaries. Boundaries that are solid or ephemeral, filled with conflicting emotions and ideas, each with different points of focus, all coming to play in a single individual. But boundaries become points of reflection and decision, and in life as in nature, which has proven to be anything but rigid and unimaginative, it is these boundary areas which spur us to grow and create, making a whole. Though riddled with conflicts, they are gathered together in an underlying principle, a human being, a work of art. At the same time we are experiencing this moment together, there is an embryo waiting to be born, a fossil whose growth has stopped and is imprinted in earthly time, a star that has died whose light is still life to us here on earth, stilled life really. So in some ways we are looking at a fake sky, yet it is this dual image of life and death, the chaotic feelings evoked by this conflict, that gives art beauty and life. Art is a human statement, because as humans grow, artists must realize that each moment is different, each piece different, and requires new imaginatively grown attempts to answer the questions of life, as nature requires creative answers to go on. The whole universe grows with time, yet its ultimate fate is death, the death of a star, the death of a planet. As an artist living in New York City, I am thoroughly influenced by its rhythm and all the craziness that goes with millions of people jostling each other in the streets and sidewalks, trying to negotiate construction and everything else that comes with living in a large metropolitan area. New York City has an edge to it, a chaos that provokes a love-hate feeling that does exist simultaneously. When I first moved to New York City, I lived in a neighborhood that was crumbling. Abandoned buildings, fires constantly, just skeletons of buildings everywhere. Images that are forever imprinted on my mind. How do humans come to terms with such chaos? Yet through all this, there is an underlying harmony, a rhythm that persists no matter what, really the flow of living. And this flow, along with a kind of dynamic balance, seeps into my collages. For a number of years, I left visual art to become a maker of functional pottery, as I felt it terribly important that people have objects for everyday use that are beautiful. The natural spontaneity I needed to create pottery, as the pliability of the clay is in constant flux, naturally led me to collage, for I find that they are best when created organically and spontaneously and then later refined. Ultimately, creating functional pottery became too limiting, and I needed a form where there were greater possibilities. So here I am, back to making collages with all the philosophical and physical dancing that goes along in creating them. I love the dynamics, the underlying structure and the color, and the texture that add to the whole. I never use a brush. I wouldn't even know how to use one. I think in impressions and placement. I love to recombine images I have used in earlier collages, and while I use Photoshop to manipulate images, it goes far beyond the mechanical, the cold, or the sterile, because I enhance them by hand, giving them a history that tells of stories of their birth. And these stories immediately connect in my mind with past civilizations, the invention of writing, the yearning for humans to communicate with other humans. I find that the most interesting thing in art is the human element, the figurative that spurs an association, a feeling, a thought, and identification. I have fallen in love with certain figures that I use again and again, my cast of characters that I keep putting into different existential and visual situations, like the flower so poignantly struggling to maintain its beauty and dignity in a world that sometimes tries to bring it down, much like the human coming to terms with day-to-day life and finding a greater meaning in that life. Flower as a reflection of the human. I have a passion for using the visual form of language, a total fascination with it. A recent trip to the glorious British Museum found me in the ancient Egyptian section, and I took endless photos of these magnificent scrolls and tombs filled with hieroglyphs. That spurred me to take pictures of pages of my old work notebooks, my own chronicle, both of which I use in my collages. I have these deep connections in my work between the ancient and the modern, between the scribes who made these beautiful scrolls so painstakingly by hand, and me on my computer typing and printing my words out on a printer, a collision of the ancient and the modern. Ever since I saw Robert Smithson's glorious spiral jetty, the land artist sculptor I was talking about in the beginning, I fell in love with the spiral. It is so provocative, and made even more so when you remember we live in a spiral galaxy, with its base in the present and its spiral reaching back into the past, or alternately reaching into the future. Time again. And then when the spiral is placed with text, it adds a deeper dimension, for it becomes a connection with past and future stories. I had the pleasure of having dinner some years back with Leonard Shlain, noted author of Art and Physics and several other provocative books. He was also a pioneering surgeon. He told me that night that before an operation, he would go over in his mind the kind of stitches he would use, because he felt that if his surgery wasn't beautiful, inside and out, he considered it failure. Art and science together. That statement, it took my breath away, because he saw the absolute necessity of beauty in life, even if no one else saw it, even if it was inside, so to speak. All this to say that what human beings can create, their ingenuity puts me in a constant state of awe, and I want my art to always reflect that awe, an awe for beauty, for broadening our cultural definition of beauty. Beauty that sometimes takes its form in the crooked line, the fragments that are discarded, the torn, the frayed, the gritty, the fingerprints of living. When people view my collages, I want them to experience a sense of transformation, again, not in any religious sense, but through associations that only they can bring. For each person comes to their own views via their own experiences, yet we are all connected in a broader sense, for we all know what it is like to try to get along in day-to-day life, how those experiences can be ecstatic or messy or contemplative or something in between. Glenn Branca, the late composer, created these sonic constructions that took on a life of their own. He mowed you down with the ecstatic. While a musical experience and viewing a collage are very different, it would be abhorrent to me if my art were viewed as cold or sterile, even when a collage has a geometrical bent. For even then, through color, the figurative and dynamics, I want it to be full with all the sensual things life is made of. And I'll end with this. Stephen Gubser, the string theorist who so tragically and recently died, said in his book, The Little Book of String Theory, in general relativity, space-time is not a static stage on which events occur, but a dynamic curved geometry. That's what I hope my collages make people feel when they view them. Thank you so much for